And welcome to our first Lunch and Learn for the year. We've had them before, but this is the first one for this academic year. I'm Nancy Schoenberg, your Associate Dean for Research in the College of Public Health, and we are so pleased to have this distinguished panel, some of whom have not yet gotten lunch, and I've encouraged them to get lunch right now. So anyway, we're going to hear about publishing, and we're going to hear today about collaborative publishing between faculty members and students. It's going to be really, really interesting. And you all, or many of you, have submitted excellent questions. So they're going to, our distinguished panel will provide some responses and their perspectives on those questions. And I'm going to, after I just give a very brief summary of what's coming up, I'm going to turn it over to April Young, who will talk a little bit about the publishing process generally. But you may or may not know that we have some fabulous events coming up. I talked about them at the Distinguished Lecture last week. I think it was last week. We've got 3 events coming up for fall that you will not want to miss because they're great events and they all offer food. So that's great. That's always a plus. So we have one coming up October 8th, and that is Dr. Sam Friedman's talk. He's our distinguished lecturer coming in from the National Development Research Institute. He's going to be talking about socially integrated multidisciplinary epidemiology, prevention, and care in public health. And he is the social... Fantastic, says Dr. Havens. He is the social network researcher par excellence, in addition to many other.
He's published more than 600 papers. I mean, he is crazy productive and smart, and just has his finger on the pulse of what's going on in the area of substance abuse and HIV, and he's amazing.
Phenomenal. So you will not want to miss it. Make sure you RSVP, because I have a feeling it might be an overflow crowd. So, it's also going to be in a very cool space on the 18th floor of Patterson Office Tower. So if you haven't been on the 18th floor of Patterson Office Tower, you are in for a treat, because you can see all of Lexington from there, including that cool Lincoln mural that's downtown. You know the one I'm talking about? Yeah, you can see it from up there. It's great. Anyway, Lunch and Learn, another one. There's another one. It's coming up in November. It's on increasing the visibility of your research, and that is by our own Robert Shapiro and Adrian Ho. They are at the Medical Center Library. So if you don't know Robert, he is a librarian par excellence. He's amazing, and he'll talk about that. And then Research 101. My goodness, you have a great opportunity to learn from our own Margaret McGladrey about how to get started in research. This is just a phenomenal opportunity. She will speak to all levels of research, but probably more basic levels. So if you haven't, been in research for a long time, this is the one to come to, because you will learn a whole lot. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Young, and she will tell you a little bit about the publishing process.
All right. Well, I think it's best if we, the panelists, just introduce themselves first. So my name is April Young. I'm an assistant professor in epidemiology. I've worked with Dr. Jennifer Havens now for a very long time, 6 years, I think. And we've published together 18 articles, and we're working on several others. So we'll be talking a bit about our experience.
Sure. I'm Jennifer Havens, and I have an appointment in the College of Medicine and Behavioral Science and the Center on Drug and Alcohol Research. And most of my research is focused on rural Appalachia, substance abuse, and the medical consequences of injection drug use.
I'm Kathy Hart, and I'm an assistant professor in health management and policy. I believe that I've worked with Jennifer on a couple of presentations, and we've also worked on some projects together when I was a student. And my research interests are women with substance use problems, particularly mothers.
I'm Tina Stutz, and I'm in the Department of Health Behavior. I have published with several mentors and then have several students that I've published with, and I'm about to publish with Julie here to my left. And Dr. Schoenberg is one of the people that I've published a bunch with. And my research interests are mostly in early childhood mental health, early identification, intervention, and implementation of evidence-based interventions in under-resourced communities.
And I am Julie Jacobs. I work as a project director with Dr. Stutz, and I recently started that role this May. I'm here mostly because I published when I was an MPH student, which I started publishing then, I guess that was like 2008, 2010 is when I was an MPH student. And I worked with Dr. Ross Brownson from Washington University. At that time, I just looked him up, he has 391 publications right now, so he's a very well-versed publisher. So anyway, that's what I'm here to talk about, is my experience on the master's level of publishing.
All right. Well, I know that a lot of you all are already familiar with the publishing process, especially the faculty. But there are students here who haven't published before, and I noticed from the questions that were submitted that we need to talk a bit about the publishing process before we launch into some of the Q&A. So I have a few slides. Matt, do you mind to hit the lights? Can you all see that okay? Mm-hmm. This is just a very quick overview. Every single step could, entail an entire 1-hour lecture, so I'm just going to fly through this. And if you have questions at the end, just bring those up then. Okay, so it starts with generating an idea, right, for a paper. And as an MPH student or as a research assistant or as a faculty member who's collaborating with someone else, there are a few things you want to do before you bring that to the attention of everyone else. In other words, before you waste everyone's time. Do you have adequate data to answer that question or explore that idea? Is it a unique contribution? And that is in two spheres. One is it a unique contribution to the literature? And the other is, have your colleagues already published on this question from these data? So you want to make sure you don't duplicate what's been done already with the project. And then you want to make sure there is an appropriate outlet for your idea. And so this is where you may explore if you do a little lit review, see what journals have published research like yours, and just make sure that there is an outlet before you embark on this very long process. So then you discuss it with your PI, or with colleagues, or with your advisor, whoever it may be. And at that point you, I think, begin to divvy up the work. And as you divvy up the work, you should have conversations about authorship. Because ultimately the authorship order, which we'll talk about a lot today, should depend on the work folks put into the paper. That's my opinion. There may be other people who have different opinions, and we can talk about that. And then you establish a timeline, and I'll show you an example. You analyze the data, draft the manuscript, and when you draft a manuscript, you usually want to target it at a journal. So the journal shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be defined before you start the writing process, because you want to tailor it to the journal you're writing to. And every journal has different aims and scopes, and every journal has different readership. So for the journals we publish in, sometimes those are targeted toward clinicians, other times they're targeted toward researchers or practitioners, and you write in a very different way, and you highlight very different things depending on the readership of the journal. Okay, and then as you go through this process, which may take 3 months or it may take 3 years, sometimes workload changes. And as that changes, you should have conversations about authorship. And if the authorship order needs to be renegotiated, then you can do that as the workload shifts. You polish the manuscript, that alone could take a year. Finalize it, and before you send anything in for publication, you get the consent of all of your co-authors. They should have all been involved to begin with, but of course you want to make sure they approve the final version. And then you have a corresponding author who submits the paper to a journal. Okay, is that clear? Do you all have anything to add to that? All right, and then once you submit a paper, that's not the end of the road, it's sort of the beginning of the road. You submit a paper, and there are editors at these journals who assess your paper and say, is this even worth our trouble? And a lot of times they will say no, and they send you a very quick rejection. If they do think that it's in line with the scope and the aims of the journal and on par with the rigor, then they'll send it out to peer reviewers, who are often just other researchers in your field. Sometimes they're very familiar with that field of work, other times they seem to be very off the wall. But in general, they should be experts on that area. The reviewers review them very carefully. They provide detailed feedback to the editor about your paper, and the editor reviews those comments, and they decide to reject or to accept your article or to request revisions. Okay, and every journal is a bit different in terms of what categories they classify your article into at that point. So as an author, if you are lucky, you get a chance to revise your manuscript and resubmit it. And that process will either happen again with sending it out to peer review, or they'll decide at that point, yes, you've addressed all of our concerns, which were minor to begin with, and we accept your article for publication. So this entire flow chart can take a year or more, depending on the speed of the journal, depending on how many issues are published each year, and on a lot of other factors. We've had things take almost 4 years to actually get into press. So you have to plan accordingly, and if you decide to publish a manuscript, you have to be committed to it for the long haul. Once it's accepted by a journal, then they'll send you proofs, and it'll be in the format that it looks like online, and you review those proofs, and it becomes in press. And eventually that journal will release it online or in paper version. Okay? So is that any questions about that? All right, so how do you select a journal? These are just two examples of journals that we often target: AIDS and drug and alcohol dependence. So these are the sorts of tables, and many of you have put these together that I've published with. Things that I look for when I'm trying to choose a journal. First, they all have to be relevant, and they all have to be peer reviewed. I see if there are any fees, because I typically do not have any money to pay for the fees, and so that's sometimes they require you pay, other times they give you the option of paying and having your article available open access. Okay, so both of these have options, and you can see the fees are pretty hefty. So if you're a faculty member writing a grant, this might be something you want to budget for.
But if it's NIH funded, it will eventually be open access anyway by law.
Right, with usually a 6 to 12 month embargo, NIH will require that it's made available on PubMed. Okay, we look at impact factors. We won't get into that. That will be covered in the next Lunch and Learn. I like to see where it's indexed. In behavioral science and in psychology, sometimes they are more interested in it being indexed on something called PsycInfo. And in medicine, they often want it to be indexed on Medline, because folks search on NCBI PubMed, and that's where you'll find these articles. So I want articles on Medline. I also look at the word count, just in anticipation of how much I'll need. And I see about the reference style, because having an APA style can really eat into your word count. And so I want to balance those two things. I usually look for AMA style journals. And then I want to know how often they publish every year, because that could affect the speed with which they get your article in press once it's accepted. Okay? Is there anything I missed that you guys consider? No? Okay. So how do you decide authorship? And Dr. Stutz has a great handouts about authorship. So these are the criteria for authorship based on whatever ICJM stands for. An author has to make substantial contributions to the conception of the design of the study, or to the interpretation of the analysis, or to the acquisition of the data for analysis. They need to be involved in drafting and revising the manuscript, and they of course need to approve the final version for submission. So these are the 3 key criteria to be an author on a paper. And it's nice to have this foundation to go back to if you have questions about authorship. And then everyone who is on the paper agrees to be accountable for what is in the paper. So this is an example, and this is the last thing I'll present, is just an authorship plan that I've found really helpful. And this is what Dr. Havens and I use. This is what I've used with colleagues at Emory to avoid wars and such. Is you have an idea, and you have a meeting with your PI and your colleagues, and you decide who is going to take ownership of that paper. You decide at the outset the authorship order. At least that's what I've found most helpful. And we lay out the task. Oops, ignore that. We lay out the task by author, and you can see the first author has the most to do. This is a real paper, so this was my student RA, an undergraduate, and she outlined the intro and discussion, prepared tables, and helped me pull together all the references and assist with editorial revisions. And I felt like she contributed enough intellectually to be included as an author. And then Dr. Havens was the PI on the study, so she certainly meets that criteria for having been involved and having created the study to acquire the data to begin with. And then was actively involved in reviewing and revising and intellectually contributing to the manuscript. So we divvied up the task, and then we try to create some sort of timeline. And you'll see that these tasks map onto what we defined for each author. And so each author has some target date to get their pieces in by. So for example, for Nika Larian, who was helping me, I gave her a deadline for the intro, the analysis being complete, tables prepared, so on, so that everyone is accountable to the process and you can meet your timeline for publication. The longer this drags on, the more likely it is that another article will be published and yours will become less innovative, or your data become more outdated. So you want to be as efficient as possible and make sure everyone is on board with what you're trying to accomplish. Are there any questions? Okay. Isn't this, after you think about this whole entire process, it's so impressive that folks like Dr. Friedman can publish 600 articles. It's like having a child, you know, or at least it feels like that. It's a 4-year process sometimes for an article. So I think it's pretty impressive for these senior faculty members to have so many. And that's it. So Rachel is going to lead us in the Q&A based on questions you submitted. And then, of course, just jump in and ask questions as you have them. And we'll have an open Q&A period at the end.
Can I say something about the handout real quick
go for
before?
it.
So the handout doesn't actually outline the authorship requirements. It does include a hilarious comic, which if you've ever taken a class from me, you get a lot of hilarious comics through me. And so this is from the Piled Higher and Deeper comic archives. This is not necessary, this is actually an example of how not to determine authorship, not how to determine authorship, but it is how a lot of people look at authorship, which is kind of amusing. The list of resources underneath, I want to tell you what each one is in case we run out of time at the end, so that if you want to look this up on your own, you know what you're looking for. The first one is just a chapter that was written, it was in an edited text by the Society of Addiction Journal Editors, and it gives a really excellent overview if you're a graduate student or junior faculty of the steps to go through and some successful strategies for getting published. The research ethics program at UC San Diego, this is all about authorship. So if you go to the website, it basically talks about all of the ethics of authorship, determining authorship order, ethics of things that you are not supposed to do, like ghostwriters, guest writers, celebrity authors who are included just because of their name, etc. The University of Colorado Board of Regents has an online tutorial specifically about publishing. And so this is I think it's 5 modules, it's either 4 or 5 modules. You sign up by your institution, you can take it even if you're not at University of Colorado. And it's basically a step-by-step process that has some quizzes, and it's really educational about the entire process, including ethical dilemmas you run into, timelines, and a lot about the publishing process that April just went through. And then the last thing is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. So these are the official recommendations for authorship that most of the journals that we publish in have accepted. And so the criteria that April just listed about substantial contributions to conception, design, acquisition of data, analysis, interpretation, drafting it, approving the final version, plus this criteria of basically creative contributions or intellectual contributions, which is sort of like a mushy criterion that is probably interpreted by different people in different ways, which is why it is important who you are deciding to write with ahead of time. So I just wanted to make sure you guys know what's on this, and you can look at this after the lunch and learn for lots more information.
Okay, so we have about 12 questions that I'd really like to get through that people have submitted. We've got about 30 minutes and then 10 for afterwards for any other remaining questions. So the first kind of section of questions is regarding who should be included as an author. So the first question is, should student, staff, data managers, and RAs be included in publications that are heavily data intensive? So they require a lot of data cleaning, data transformation, things like that, even if they aren't heavily involved in the manuscript preparation process.
I've done a lot of talking, so I'll let you guys start it off.
I would say it depends. So, for example, for our study, we have a lot of social network data, which April took a lot of time. I mean, hours and days and weeks and months prepping. So if someone is going to include the variables that were generated by April, even if she's not heavily involved necessarily in the drafting of the manuscript, I would certainly include her as an author because that was a very substantial contribution to the analysis, especially if they're focusing on network. So that's kind of an example where perhaps she didn't initiate the idea and she's not heavily involved in drafting the manuscript, but there was a substantial contribution in terms of data, data cleaning in that case, and data collection. I think it also depends on who the person is and when you brought them in, what you had negotiated up front in terms of authorship. So sometimes if I bring a staff member in, that's never a discussion and it's never assumed on their part because potentially it's not even an interest of theirs or, is going to help them, go forth in their career because that's not something that they're after. Like our data manager, I don't think, if he came to me and initiated an idea, certainly he would be an author, but at the same time I think he understands that grabbing the data set and getting it clean and ready for us doesn't necessarily, isn't a contribution that would be worthy of authorship. So I think it's very, very case by case, so.
I agree, and I think it comes down to the negotiations at the outset, which I think for students and for junior faculty, but probably especially for students, it can be an uncomfortable conversation to have if you don't feel like you have the kind of relationship with the person that you're writing with that you can be pushy about it or bring it up if they haven't already brought it up. But it's really important to talk about it at the outset because, for instance, if you go to these, I think it's on the University of Colorado's tutorial website, they have some case studies, ethical questions where they say, okay, here's the scenario. So this one person spent almost 800 hours processing and cleaning data, which was more than they would have spent writing the article themselves, and they were not included as an author because they didn't actually write anything in the manuscript. So similar to what Jennifer was describing or Dr. Havens was talking about, you can spend, like April did, tons and tons of time cleaning data, but if the person that you're working with doesn't consider that enough of a contribution for authorship, you want to know that before you commit to do that work up front. And if you think that you should be, you have to be able to talk about that with the person. So I think that at the outset, because it is case by case, and I think it does depend, that particular criteria is kind of fuzzy, and so you have to be willing and kind of assertive enough to talk to that about the person that you're working with to make sure that their understanding is in line with what you are hoping to get out of it.
And I've advised students who have gone into academic positions or have become research staff at universities to have that conversation. If they were offered the job, to have that conversation with the person that's offered them the job to say, for them to say up front, I'm very interested in trying to publish, and are you open to that? And if you're looking for folks to work with, for example, if you're going on to a PhD program, it's helpful to look at people's CVs and see if they are publishing with their students. And if they're not, and that's something that's important to you, maybe that's something to avoid, a mentor to avoid. So I think these things are just important to explore at the beginning, like Tina was saying.
So, if a student has a dissertation capstone committee member, should they be included on the publications arising from the project, just regardless? So they're a committee member, you decide to publish that project, who should be included, and how do you decide that?
So I can speak to this since I had a lot of experience as a graduate student and a postdoc publishing with my mentor. Certainly if someone on your committee, you're using their data to write your capstone or your dissertation, I think it's appropriate to include them in authorship. I had an interesting experience where I had a committee member who was not my chair, but who really, I had to learn a completely new type of data analysis to do a longitudinal study, and she was really instrumental in helping me to learn that. I took some I went to some workshops and some trainings, but really I felt like she played a critical role in enabling me to conduct the analysis. So when it came time for publication, I said, I would like to include you as a co-author, and she said, that's not necessary because this is my job as a committee member. And so I think that that's one of those things where not every committee member would probably say that. It just depends. But I think that it's always good to err on the side of including someone who's helped you to be successful in writing the manuscript, and then they can sort of let you know whether or not they want to be included.
And I think it's helpful to, again, have those conversations at the very beginning. When a student comes to me and wants to work on a capstone, I immediately say, do you want to publish this? And if so, I'm going to be really hard on you because this needs to be perfect if we're going to submit it for peer review. And we talk about, in our very first meeting where we discuss this, we talk about authorship order, and we make sure that we're on the same page. Typically, if I have a lot of capstone students competing, for a chair or whatever, I will pick the students who want to publish their work because that helps me as a faculty member, and I think it helps the students both build their CV and learn about this process of just building the scientific literature.
So speaking of order of authorship, we'll kind of move in that direction. So who decides the order of authorship on a writing project? And then what are the main considerations? We've talked about some of those already, but we can go into some more detail.
I think certainly when you have a student, if it's a situation where you have a graduate student and a mentor or PI, it's really up to the PI to take leadership on that. But it needs to be a conversation. I don't think it should be one-sided. Certainly, I think if you are offering authorship to that student, there's some assumption that they will be the first author. I know that's not the case in all disciplines, but I think in public health, certainly, if they are going to do a substantial part of, crafting the intro and the discussion and certainly the methods and the analysis, that should be an option to them. But I think it's difficult. I think if you are a graduate student, you wouldn't be able to necessarily go in and negotiate on your behalf and say, this is how it's going to be. I think I would be a little taken aback if I was a PI. But it certainly needs to be a conversation, and I think that it's up to you as the PI to kind of at least lay the groundwork. I think with April, I maybe only had to do that once, and then I figured out that we were on the same page, and then just kind of let her take over from there, so.
Yeah, I think it's very different from the outset of your publishing relationship to the end. It gets much more efficient and less formal and awkward as you work through these things.
I will say, on the student side of what Dr. Havens is saying, that ideally the PI will sort of help you to establish those guidelines, but oftentimes as a student I would have to mention that, and we talked a lot about, have this discussion up front, but if the PI doesn't mention it, it's sort of like, well, how does that occur? And it is very uncomfortable being a student, and talking to someone that's at a senior level and having that conversation, but there are definitely professional ways of doing that, and sort of I tend to just acknowledge at the outset that I know this is sort of awkward, but just so that I can be as productive and successful in this and help you as much as possible, can we talk about order of authorship? And they're always like, oh, of course. But I think it is really important to have that conversation up front and just to acknowledge, it might be a little uncomfortable, but it will save you a lot of discomfort later on. Absolutely. And especially as a student, another thing to mention is if you're not going to be first author, you might want to know, does this mean I'll be second author? Because your PI might be planning on including other people in the paper that you don't know about. So it's good to know up front, who else is going to be on this publication? Where am I going to fall in this order? And those are good questions, I think, to ask.
I also, when I was working with Ross, it was clear that I would be first author. I was taking the lead on all the analysis and did almost all the writing of papers, and clear also that he would be the last author as the PI, and then kind of let him decide everything in the middle. And usually there were all the other co-investigators and all that, and that just wasn't something that I was able to determine the order of, so it all fell on the PI.
Can you all just briefly talk about order of authorship in general? So first compared to last, like what are second, third, what do those mean?
Well, I think it's probably going to be different for everyone. But say I was gonna take the lead on a paper. A lot of times though, I want to be able to include students on that. So say I asked April, and we had a couple of these where she did the analysis. So I was first because I did, I came up with the idea and crafted a lot of the intro and discussion and methods. But she had a substantial contribution as an analyst. So, it was me, then April, and then basically, depending on the topic, usually you have, with NIH grants, there are a series of co-investigators. So basically, kind of looking through their expertise and then kind of put that on the order, I knew that, one person may be really interested in mental health. So, I knew that they would really read through the draft and have some really substantial, potentially editorial contributions to that, versus another co-investigator who I knew needed to be included, but at the same time I knew this really wasn't a research interest of theirs, and certainly they would give it a cursory glance and do what they're supposed to do as a co-author and co-investigator, but they weren't going to give it as much as someone who had a really a real interest in the research topic. So. But as a PI, I would realize that it shouldn't be on the student. It wouldn't have been appropriate for April to be like, well, I think Dr. Lukefeld should be here, and Dr. Walsh should be here. You know what I mean? That wasn't her. That was certainly my responsibility to kind of figure out the middle folks. And sometimes those, I don't know, you've probably seen some of those publications where there's 10,000 authors or something, especially those physics papers. Those ones are crazy. Where it takes up, you're searching PubMed and the whole page is just that, one article. Because you put some random term in there that clearly brings up physics-related articles. So I don't envy those folks, and I think that clearly there's a process that they've all negotiated up front. But, most of the papers I think that you all are going to be involved with are going to have anywhere from, 2 to 6 or 7 authors. You're certainly, as graduate students, not going to be asked, I don't think, to determine the order. But in general, again, the most substantial contribution, first author, and then if the PI is not the first author, then oftentimes they're the last author, because again, they're the ones who slave through writing the grant and getting the money and collecting the data, and there's a lot involved in that. So, and then everywhere in between is going to be something that the PI is going to determine.
And the big picture of why it matters, I think, is another important thing to discuss, in that for tenure and promotion, first author publications matter a lot.
First and last.
First and last, right, if you're a senior author. And so that's why we're even having this conversation. For a student to have a first author publication is a big deal for a student, and it's a big deal for a faculty member, and so that's why these conversations about authorship can become so contentious, because there's a lot at stake sometimes, especially for junior faculty members and students.
And I was just going to say, it sometimes depends on the career stage of the person that you're writing with. So if you're writing with a pre-tenure junior faculty member, it is harder for them. If you're writing on their project, emotionally, with this whole promotion and tenure thing looming in their distance, it's harder for them to say, yes, you should be first author and I'll be last. Now, last is still good, but in reviewing junior faculty's publication list, there's a huge push to have more and more first author publications. When you're working with a senior investigator who's been writing for years and has a lengthy list of publications, last author is what they're supposed to be. I mean, it's their study, that's kind of the place for the senior investigator who has kind of been over the entire thing. And then the first author is really the person who did the most, whose idea was, and who produced the most in terms of the publication. So it can depend a little bit on the security level and anxiety of the person that you're working with, which again is why you want to talk about it earlier rather than later.
So if the person who generates the idea or concept for a manuscript is not the same person who takes the lead on writing it, who should be the first author? And if the person who conceived the idea is not at all involved in writing the paper, do they still deserve co-authorship?
So that question was mine, because I've
You have to answer it.
I was
like, I can't think of a good
This
example.
person shall not be named, but it was not Jennifer. Yes, where a person, the investigator conceived of the idea and then had me write the entire paper, and then that person put his or her name first. And like 6 other people, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, who I'm not even sure had read the whole paper. So this happens, and it was a tough battle for me as a student at the time, because ultimately it was that person's idea to do the paper, but ultimately I wrote the paper. And so where do we belong? And I don't have an answer for that. I forfeited that battle for the sake of my career, and let that person have first author. He took first author, she took first author. And so I stayed second. And everything worked out. It was not a paper in JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine, or maybe I would have fought harder. But it was still a tough debate, and I'm not sure that that person was wrong. And so I'm interested to hear y'all's thoughts, and for any of the faculty members in here who have had experience like this, y'all's thoughts.
One thing I'd add to that is that in the last, I don't know how many years actually, because I haven't been around that long, 10 years maybe, there's been, ever since this ICNJE, the first version of it I think was in 2006, about ethics of authorship and recommended order of authors. So a lot of journals, when they started adopting these recommendations, some have tried to make it even more transparent. And so one of the things that you have to do when you submit a manuscript is say who did what. So sometimes you will see in a journal when you get to the end of the article, it will list like so-and-so had the idea, so-and-so collected the data and analyzed and managed it, so-and-so wrote the introduction to the discussion, and they will actually break it down who did what to kind of eliminate any questions about whether everybody contributed to this manuscript or not. But not all journals do that, and I'm not sure what would have happened in your case if that paper had gone to a journal that required that. I don't know if anybody's looking at that and saying, you know, the first author is supposed to be the one who's contributed the most. If this person just says it was their idea, I don't know what the journal, it would be the editor. I mean, I don't know what the journal editor would do. Is somebody raising their hand back there? No? Okay.
It's tough because those guidelines, they don't talk about authorship order, they only talk about qualifications for being a author. And so it's really tough to decide these sorts of things. Do you have any?
I thought that whole situation was bold, and I think I advised you to well, I think I also advised you to kind of let it go because it wasn't necessarily an area that you were ultimately interested in being a part of long term. So I think that was part of it too, but I think that for the most part, you know, the thing is when you have one of these big NIH grants, literally, how many data points do we have? Like millions of data points. There are no less than 100 papers we could publish from this. Certainly I have thought about probably if you come to me and say, you know, I'd like to write a paper, certainly I've probably thought about it. You know, Rachel and I have these meetings all the time. We have a laundry list of 100 things that I say I want to look at. She's like, yeah, that's great, you know, but if she's going to do all the work, I am not going to take credit for that idea. So I think that was really bold of that person to do that, and
well, I think it depends too if it's in accordance with the specific aims of the grant. So if the PI has written a grant, and there are usually 3-4 specific aims for an NIH grant, and that's one of the key papers coming out of the grant. And you as an RA or student, whatever, come and say, oh, we should look at, you know, X. And that was the reason they wrote the grant, and they haven't, you know, disclosed that to you, then I think that that's clear. The PI should have ownership of that analysis because that is one of the key components of the grant.
but they should also write it up.
They should also write it up. So, you know, but I think it depends, you know, if this is one of the main purposes of the project, it might be a little different. Corinne, you are nodding your head a lot. Do you have
It's funny because I think actually a lot of people have stories. So I know when I was a grad student, I have a paper that I'm second author on, that I wrote the entire thing. I actually was the one who added those particular questions to the survey. So it wasn't even something the PI had considered before I came along, which made it actually, I think, worse where I was going. But I know the other grad students, we all have a paper where we're second author that we really should have been first. And we all ceded because in the interest of our long-term careers, it was not worth, it was not worth the fight. That as a grad student being second author and having, like, that was still a publication. And I published like 12 articles with that person. So like, those were more important than that one. But it's an interesting debate, like how can you actually, is there a way of having something like the authorship criteria guidelines that actually gets more into order and like what does it take to be first author? It's another ring. I have a friend whose husband is an in economics, and they actually do, their authorship is alphabetical, always. Like, it's sort of, they don't, which is a very interesting, I know, which is a bummer for me as Dr. Williams, but it was just interesting. Because the idea was, their idea is that everyone, in order to be listed as an author, you should actually be contributing to it, and you shouldn't have these people who are sort of added just because. And so if you have everyone contributing equally, order doesn't matter. Which I think is very
That's very discipline specific.
yeah, it's very
So-
discipline specific.
Yeah, and there are some, and you all have probably encountered this, there are some disciplines where solo authorship is the only way. Even if if your graduate student contributes greatly to that, it's solo authorship or bust, which I think is insane. And I think that really goes against all of the recommendations from NIH that we're doing all this multidisciplinary research, and then you have to, in order for you to get promotion tenure, you have to publish a bunch of solo author papers. But again, it's very discipline specific.
So, moving a little bit different, managing conflict within collaboration. So this is kind of, I think, a good segue, but how do you handle it when one member of your committee disagrees with the presence of another committee member as a co-author? So again, this is kind of a student role, you know, talking with a senior member about the presence of another.
I avoid
Yeah, that's
conflict
tough.
in general. I haven't had that. I really try to surround myself with good people at the outset that I know aren't going to get into these. I know it happens, but I have zero to contribute to that, because unless you know of something that happened that I didn't know.
Yeah, this is tough, it happens.
I was just gonna say, you know, so depending on your department and your field, sometimes the composition, if this is talking about a capstone, which I assume it is, sometimes the composition of your committee, in some departments, it's sort of assigned to you, and in some, you invite people, right? So it's important that your chair have some input about who else is going to be on the committee in the first place. And you may have somebody who you want on there, but I think that in general, the role of your chair is to guide you through the capstone or the dissertation, and that includes what happens afterwards. And so if they know at the outset that there is somebody who, for whatever reason, they are not wanting to be part of this, it would be good to know that ahead of time rather than when you're trying to publish later and you have a ridiculous conflict over something like this, which is ridiculous, really. I mean, I agree with Jennifer, I can't imagine, I don't know how that came up, but that should not be something really that you should be having to deal with at the time of working with manuscripts and publishing. So again, like this common theme that is kind of running through this entire panel is that so many things can be avoided if you address them early before it becomes a problem. That's what I would recommend.
Yeah, and I guess thinking back to, I think I published several of my dissertation manuscripts, but thinking even back to when I was forming the committee, there were two people that I did want to have on my committee that my chair said, no, they fight constantly. You will get nothing accomplished because they will just argue the whole time. And I assume it would have probably been the same, thinking about their personalities, would have, when we actually got to the point, 3 years down the road, when we were actually publishing, it would have been the same.
Yeah.
Like they would have picked out that other person's comments and literally started fighting then within the manuscript. So, but I had a very astute chair who said, no, you cannot have, she's like, I won't sit in that meeting if they're there together. So, but again, that was so early in the process that if I didn't have her to guide that, I would have been like, oh, let's have these two people. If she didn't know any better, it would have been ugly.
Yeah.
So then, what about if the dynamics change and allocation of effort changes after you've already had this initial conversation of order of author? So, you're on down the line. We've mentioned renegotiating co-authorship in order, but how do you do that? How do you bring it up? Sounds like another awkward conversation, but, how do you do it?
I think that's the PI's job. I mean, I really do. That happens a lot. You have a graduate student who graduates, who goes into a different, decides, epi is not for me, whatever. For whatever reasons, they're no longer involved in the project. if they still contributed a lot to the project, we have a postdoc she's been gone for what, 2 years, 3 years, but she contributed a lot. She's still on papers that we're publishing because at the time she contributed a lot to the initial when we initially put the paper together. So I think it's really kind of up to the PI to make sure that it's fair in how we renegotiate, but have a conversation with still the people that are still involved and the person who is leaving or no longer involved with the project. But really, that shouldn't be on the graduate student to, they may initiate that conversation and just say, hey, you know, so-and-so is leaving, do we need to talk about this? And certainly, I would never be upset with a graduate student for initiating that conversation. That's completely legitimate.
And what if the PI is, I don't want to say that the problem, right? So what if the PI, yeah, if the PI is the first author, and all of a sudden they're dumping on the second author, then what? You know, how do you negotiate that, especially if it's a new relationship?
I don't know. I feel like as the PI I would be like, I'm not doing what I should be doing, I'm gonna move myself.
Right.
But not everyone has the same wherewithal.
I've had a lot of positive experiences, I promise.
I know, I actually feel like we should talk about that before we get to the
Yeah.
Q&A, because most of these are kind of like conflict and ordership, but I think there's so many benefits to students and faculty publishing together, that we should talk about that too, right?
Because I've never had these problems
I
personally.
know, this is beautiful. So Julie,
Right.
I mean, you like
Yeah.
published all the way for how, I don't know
I
how
have,
long.
yeah, I have 8
Probably.
publications, and there was a student who just couldn't do it, and then that student had to get moved further into the pile in the middle, and a new person became first author, and that was really the only time out of 8 publications, going on 9, that anything crazy happened.
Was that pretty painless?
It wasn't even crazy. What?
Was that pretty painless?
No, but that's a long story. And it involved, it's more than just that she couldn't do it, so,
Mm.
yeah. Yes, there's a lot of context.
Yeah, I think in general things work. I mean, we've published 18 now and no problem. But I think it's because we have these conversations up front. But things do happen, and it's important for you to know this as a student, because you need to protect your own interests to the extent that you can, which sometimes is limited.
And I'll add, whether you're having the conversation up front or renegotiating, something I started doing probably really early on in my graduate career when I started publishing with my mentor and other people is to get in writing. And there's a really informal way that you can do that, but where you still, because I like to know sort of the division of labor very specifically. That was helpful to me as a student. But I would meet, you generally have an in-person meeting, and then I would send an email and say, so we had this meeting today, here's my understanding of our conversation. And then just sort of jot down a few points and then say, does this look good to you? Is there, are we on the same page? And then sort of proceed from there. And that has really been helpful to me, where it's not like, sign this contract, but you're saying, are we on the same page about this? And in that, I mean, mentioning even, you're gonna be first author and do this part, I'm gonna be second author and do this part, is that correct? That's been very helpful, and I've gone back to those emails many times when I forget what I'm, where I am in the list.
So, last question before we'll open it up. But this is a post-submission issue. So if a student submits a capstone or a manuscript for publication and major revisions are requested by the editor, can the faculty member take over lead authorship, or what, what can they do? They put in all this work to push it forward, but maybe the student's moved on to a new job, doesn't really have the time, personal matters come up, lots of things can happen. So where do co-authors and the faculty members stand with pushing that manuscript forward?
I don't think I would personally change the author order. I mean, it's still the student's idea, and it was just my job to kind of shepherd them through the process. But again, it gets tricky depending on what point in your career you are and how much work if you have to completely rework the manuscript, you start to get in your own head and say, well, this is kind of now mine. I mean, I can see that, but personally, I would still leave the student as first author, but I think it's gonna be, again, very specific to the situation.
Any other thoughts, last thoughts before we open it up, or do you all have questions?
I do have one last thing to
Yes.
mention, because I've worked with a couple different mentors and different people across campus. So one thing that is good to know up front, as Dr. Havens mentioned, I think on a lot of her projects, all the co-Is are included on a lot of papers, but on work I've done with another person, that's not the expectation. So I've had a paper where I was second author, and there were 3 of us. And then at the very end, when I got the notification it was submitted, there were like 6 authors, or 7 authors, and I had no knowledge that that was gonna be the case, and you can argue it either way, but I felt sort of like that took away a little bit from my role, as opposed to what I was used to, where there were 3 authors. So I think it's just good, just for you to know what it's gonna look like, asking up front if the person, the PI, includes their co-Is on everything, because I think that varies by discipline as well.
And I think it even varies, we've started to kind of even vary that by paper, just because it's very methodologically focused. You know, it's usually just April and I and one other or 2 other people. But if it's one of those main aims that, you know, everyone, all the co-Is contributed to the formulation of those aims, then certainly it's going to be the group. And again, that goes and shows collaborative effort between this group. So when you're submitting for, say, a continuation, it shows that, you know, everyone has been actively involved. This is the group that needs to go forward and be funded hopefully for years to come.
And before we open it up, I was just gonna say my one little positive thing, since we have been talking about all this kind of conflict and negotiation and everything, that it is really fun to get to do this. I mean, so if you're in a program where writing is something that you wanna do and publishing is what you wanna do, find somebody who publishes with students and work with them, because you can first of all learn an immense amount, and you can be involved in things that you aren't in your normal student activities and your classes. And so, first of all, it's also a really good kind of stepping stone, where if you decide that if you don't know yet that you wanna do research or academia for your future, but you wanna give it a try, this is a really good way of doing it, because you kind of get a very intense crash course in what basically everybody up here does all day, every day, all the time. So if you hate it, that's good to know up front. And if you like it, then you've started developing relationships with people, not only the PI or the person that you're writing with, but other people on that grant too. It's really how you start networking and meeting more people in the field, and it can be a really great experience.
Yeah, and I think too, like, not publishing for the sake of publishing, like you publish because you're contributing something to the literature, and hopefully contributing to reducing health disparities or inequities or whatever. And so I think that it's important to think about that, and also think about it in a way that is your responsibility to your participants who have spent a lot of time providing you data, or to community members who have gained you access to some population. It's your responsibility to put that into the literature. Otherwise, in some way, it was a waste of their time, the participants and your colleagues. And so I think that there is it's like a moral imperative to publish if that was the background of the project.
Hi, my name is Claire. I'm from one of those fields that has very different publishing practices, and that's anthropology. And anthropology is pretty much, for many people, it's a single author field. So the idea of how to divvy up work is very different for me. My question is about publishing collaboratively when you aren't within that hierarchical teacher-student relationship, and when you are a postdoc or a junior faculty member, and you might be leading a paper, but you're still collaborating with people who are higher than you in terms of their seniority, and also still higher in the hierarchy. So how do you go about leading that conversation when usually they might be the PI on the data that you're dealing with, or they might be an expert in the topic, but it might be your data. How do you lead that conversation with people who, in terms of how much you can ask them to contribute, but they aren't technically your boss anymore? How does that, could you just give some reflections on how to do that?
we've transitioned through this, where I was first a grad student, and then an analyst, and now we're both faculty. And so I feel like that transition has been pretty smooth because there was a respectful relationship in place as a student. And so actually not much has changed. But I think that all depends on the relationship, which isn't a great answer to your question, but I feel like now it has become a bit more independent, but the transition hasn't been as difficult as it may be given a different relationship at the outset. Kathy, you've been through something similar now, right?
I'm trying to think. I mean, I've had a similar experience, I think, to you two, with my mentor, where we're continuing sort of to publish, but still, I think the general guidelines apply, where if you have an idea, telling them about it, asking them what they want their role to be, and just trying to negotiate that. But I agree, it can be tricky, I think, going from that student role to faculty, and since I'm new, I'm still sort of navigating it, so.
And I think, Claire, you have a really good in being like, my field is very different. Walk me through the process, and I think that will give you an idea of where their head is in terms of, what they expect from you, what you can expect from them, and then if you're still not kind of getting the answers that you want, maybe then just have to have the frank conversation. But I feel like, since we are in the same department, and knowing some of the people that we will publish with, most people will get what you're trying to ask them and hopefully be able to answer in a way that is satisfactory for everyone involved. And I have not come across anybody at UK that has been outwardly hostile about having that conversation about authorship. So I don't think that you should feel bad about having to have that conversation. And like I said, I think you coming from a completely different discipline is a really good way for you to start that conversation without it being awkward, because you can come in and be like, I have no idea what goes on in behavioral science, even if you do, and then someone would be very happy to lead, let me guide you through that process, so I think it's probably even you've got a little bit of an advantage there, having that conversation.
I agree, and I think that same kind of strategy can be used even if you don't have the anthropology card to play. You can be like, I'm a student and I haven't done this before, help me understand. And that kind of request, like coming at it from even if you're a junior faculty member and you've published with other people before, that's not necessarily who this new colleague is, right? You may be equal to them in terms of kind of the hierarchy, or they may be senior to you, or the reverse, you may be senior to them. But having that conversation whenever it's a new person that you're working with, and just saying, this, my experience before may not be the way that we're going to do it, so let's talk about it now. Or I'm a student, I haven't done this before, can you help me understand how this is kind of discussed ahead of time and agreed upon? And that way you're conveying that you want to discuss it and agree upon it ahead of time, but you're coming at it from sort of a help me understand position, which it is handy to be able to say I'm from anthropology and we write books by ourselves. But even if you're not, you can use that same approach, I think.
And I think you can also probably have some informal conversations with people who have been around for a while in the department and say, I'm thinking about starting a collaboration with so-and-so, have you had any experience with that? And just people you feel comfortable with, and kind of get a lay of the land. And if they say stay away from that person, I wrote this whole paper and they put me, fifth author or something, then you kind of know that maybe that's not the person you should be initiating collaborations with. Or if they come to you, you maybe come up with a very convenient excuse for why you can't.
Your spread's so thin.
Yeah, exactly. I'm so busy.
So I think we maybe have time for one more question.
So when you're working on your capstone and you are aiming to publish, I mean, your capstone is basically an assignment. It's your end assignment. How much work is acceptable to allow a chair member or one of the co-committee members to do on your paper? Because, I mean, it is supposed to be your work. It's supposed to be what you're able to produce.
I don't know if I can answer that, but I would say in my MPH program, none. I mean, they would provide feedback in terms of you're going in the right track, but nothing, unless it was good. Once it got past the stage of, defending your capstone, then potentially if we're gonna take it in the area of publishing, certainly that's when, they would get involved, but up until that point, I would say, no.
Yeah, I would totally agree.
Okay.
I think, especially if you know it's heading toward publication, as a faculty member, you guide them very carefully. Especially you want to make sure the data analysis are right before they move forward to publishing. And when they defend, then you can become more involved in additional concepts or different approaches to the analyses. Radmila is a good example. I was her capstone chair, and it has taken us like 6 months after her defense to actually get it ready for submission, because there was a lot to be done after that defense where I could be more heavily involved. And she's first author, I'm second author, and I think that that's a fair distribution after that point. But I totally agree, otherwise you're taking over their assignment.
Right.
And even though in some departments I think that the expectation is that you're writing a manuscript that is publishable, all those questions that April put up at the beginning about what journal is it going to, what's their focus area, what's their page length, what citation style, those things are not things that you can necessarily build into your capstone from the beginning because of what the expectations are of your department and your committee members. And so once you have a final product, it's been defended and it's done, then you're kind of reconceptualizing it again and, usually shortening it, often tailoring it to a specific audience, sometimes publishing more than one thing from that capstone. So I would agree with these guys that generally the advisor or your chair is not really writing anything or doing anything for you. They might be helping you know that you're doing the right thing, but then afterwards they can contribute a lot more.
I have one final comment really quickly. And I think you touched on this earlier, but if you have the opportunity to publish with faculty, I would say absolutely take them up on it, because when I went on the job market just last year, almost 100% of my publications were because faculty had asked me to be on a project. So if you have an interest, it doesn't hurt to go up to a faculty member and say, I saw that you're doing work in this area, is there anything you would like me to help you with? But it's a great opportunity to build your CV, especially if you plan on continuing a research career.
And often, like both Jennifer and April said, we have a lot of ideas for things that we want to write and not enough time to do them. I mean, I have a backlog of things that I can't get done and more things that I want to do. So if there's somebody who's really interested and really good at writing and wants to get this experience, it's a great way it's like a win-win for everybody.
I agree with that. Even at a master's level, I have no desire to continue to my PhD, but it's a very marketable skill in the academic realm to be able to contribute substantially to manuscripts, so it's helped a lot.
I just wanted to comment what April mentioned earlier. It's my experience with manuscript and capstone and now in publication is so positive, so I'm surprised that so many issues came out. And our relationship was very professional. We spoke about everything up front, and I'm just grateful for the support and mentorship that I was able to obtain.
Yeah, I think it's crazy when you have as much data. Like, I know there are hundreds of investigators at universities around the country who have so much data, and I think it's crazy that they aren't letting students contribute to that. I mean, it only helps everybody involved. Like, I don't understand that process when, I hear colleagues say, oh, I don't really have any students working on that project, and, they're taking the brunt of all the writing on their own, and I'm gonna be like, your life would be so much more enriched if you would just let some graduate students, take the reins and do something and contribute. And so just stay away from those people who don't have that kind of point of view. So.
All right, well, thank you guys for coming, and hopefully you'll be able to come to other events. Grab some pizza if there's any left over on your way out. And,
if anybody hasn't signed in, please do. If you need a certificate and haven't given you one already, please get it from me.